All right, guys, now here is a second essential point to understand about grip and the ring in particular. The hand itself is capable of a very important motion. This deviation along the plane of the ulna and the radius. When the hand goes downward towards the pinky, this is referred to as ulnar deviation, right? We've discussed this if you've seen my Renovated Boxing 2 hinge punching download. We go into this in great detail, but the natural configuration of the wrist when hammering is not to keep the wrist completely boxed in like this, but rather it's that extension here which is going to do everything. If you would like some deep literature, if you want to do a deep dive on this, first great book, Thumbs, Toes, and Tears by Chip Walter. That's a great one on evolutionary traits. It goes significantly into hand, specifically thumb formation, finger dexterity. If you want even more than that, it's Frank Wilson's The Hand. And this is only about this sort of evolution of the hand, how much of the hand's evolution dictated change in the brain, or did it predate the brain and then affect the hand? Either way. Now, ulnar deviation is a huge component of a lot of motions. If I think of swinging a basic stick, here I'm going to use a polycarbon Roman Gladius from Cold Steel. Anytime you swing a weapon or a stick, for example, one of the major factors is ulnar deviation. I will very rarely hit a target with a squared angle in my arm. It's rather the ability to deviate the ulnar facet of my wrist and to have the weapon, the striking tool, be on almost the identical axis, the same plane as my forearm, that allows me to get length, extension, and therefore maximum leverage and centripetal force coming into my target. So ulnar deviation is everything on a slice. When we look at something like a karambit, we talk very often about the need on these underhand shots to hook up, which is radial deviation, and on an orthodox grip to hook down, like I'm casting a fishing rod, specifically for that reason, because the deviation towards the tip of the weapon allows me to maximize, just like I'm throwing a rock or casting a fishing rod. So this is absolutely essential. If we look at the evolution of many weapons, something like a Gladius, for example, they can have different lengths of handle. This one has a bigger one. Sometimes on certain Gladiuses, specifically, I have a Celtic sword at home. It's a really choked up, very small grip, and so it's hard to really deviate without that grinding into my wrist and my thumb. And when you stab, it's not really a deformed bent wrist formation, but because of the choked grip, very often it's lateral or straight up. So you can imagine, moving the shield and the phalanx and coming straight up, or coming over the top, coming around with a lateral in an open environment. But this idea that you could open and extend straight with that kind of broken wrist formation, again, it might feel okay in the air. You'll see a lot of stunt work where guys do this, but if you actually hit a target with that, it shoots right into your tendons here and can cause a lot of damage on your wrist, can cause you to strip your grip right away. Many weapons evolve. This is just a wooden trainer of a Filipino pistol grip style, but this grip is designed to have that little retention hook on the bottom, and people see this and sometimes they go, ugh, it feels very odd, but this is really not a chopper or a slicer. This is a deep stabbing weapon, and this kind of an angle is ideal for the wrist, this indexing of the index finger where I point like I'm pulling on a trigger. Something like a kukri, for example, have this amazing Nepalese kukri. This is a great example of a fantastic chopper. It's amazing for hacking. The natural weight of it is incredible. But when stabbing, we have this very natural alignment in my wrist, right, that doesn't hurt the wrist, and it gives me this big spearing fluted end that just deeply goes in. People often initially hold this and go, ugh, it feels so weird, I'd never stab with that, because it feels tip heavy. But the second you stab, you go right into a punching bag up to the handle. It's a fantastic weapon, and as a cleaving weapon, I mean, these things are incredible. We saw them used all throughout the north of India and further up. They're powerful, powerful weapons. So these are examples of purpose-built weapons that were built on an intuitive understanding of this ulnar deviation and the need for flexion in the wrist. A katana, for example, is the same thing. Katanas are curved by nature, right? Because during the forging, there would be mud generally placed on the back of the blade to allow only the cutting edge to be exposed to the most extreme tempering, and this allowed you to get a very, very sharp tip without making the entirety of the blade brittle. But as a natural result, there were differing contraction rates, and the back of the katana would get tighter, and depending on how it was forged, it would curve to some degree. That gave you a very fluid cutting edge, but it also requires, when stabbing, that the wrist not be square. Again, as we said before, it's primarily the bottom fingers couching it for the extra sort of anti-leverage, if you will, and my index finger is naturally going to just accordion up like that and give me the extension to stab. But if I look at a lot of traditional swords, there is a sort of an area just above the crossguard, which is known as the ricasso. And the ricasso is a dead portion of the sword. It is an unsharpened portion of the sword. If we look at medieval swords, that would allow the wielder, I'll use the gladius as a stand-in, but that would allow the wielder to go to that unsharpened portion for added leverage and fight with two hands. There's a huge misconception, largely promoted by the media, by films, that sword fights were always these clashing duels. But if we look at traditional manuals and engravings and sculptures and paintings, we know that the second hand was often placed on the ricasso, on the dull portion, so that the weapon would have greater leverage and could be used two-handed. We know that even on the bladed portion with a glove, the blade was often grabbed, and that the cross hilt could be used as a cleaving axe for piercing armor, particularly on downed opponents. And we know that as swords developed, the ricasso became quite involved. Here I have a World War II Japanese naval saber, and when we draw that, it is fundamentally a variation of a shingunto, or a Japanese machined katana blade. So it's a very long blade on a very short handle. If I try to choke that and bend the wrist, it is painful here. I naturally have to let it kind of sit, right? So that's one of the fundamental drills in saber work, is rocking on the fulcrum to see that I can go from a choked grip where everything is touching with the palm to dropping it until it's naturally kind of sitting against the hand fat and the thumb and being stopped primarily by the pinky. When I stab with that saber, I must have an indexing. So many people develop the habit of pinkying over the guard like this to get even greater point. You'll see some medieval swords will affix a single loop here, or a single secondary guard, like a cross cruciform, to block the finger. But over time, the ricasso developed to become quite ornate, and you'll see baskets with woven, twirling nests of these ornate rings and loops. But internally, there was always a comfort-built section for either finger to go in. They're ambidextrous, the sort. So there's always an area for either your right or your left index finger to go in, precisely so we can get this indexing of the first finger. When we get to a karambit, it is very awkward to grab the karambit square. And one of the mistakes people make when they grab it is they try to keep it square like that, and it kind of defies the natural curvature in the handle. When the index finger goes in there, there's that natural indexing and pointing of the trigger, right? So-called trigger finger up to the top. And that's what gives me greater flexibility in my wrist. It's a very simple example. If I take my fist squarely and I try to power squeeze it as tight as I can, and then try to move, right, you see that there's limitations in sort of how I can orient the fist. When I go to punch a target, my fist naturally will orient by small ulnar and radial deviations. It will. You're never purely square. There's always little bends. Punch will have a little bend in the wrist, and there's strength in that. This is a misconception that we have to be box square. You're not going to get correct faceting. You're not going to get optimal radial and ulnar overlap. When I grab a karambit, it naturally makes my hand line up. For example, in Ryukyu Kempo, they actually punch. We punch on a diagonal like that to have optimal power in the forearm and to have the facets of the fist align with the sort of roof-like shape of the ribs, so that I can maximize my impact on the diaphragm. So it's the exact same thing with a karambit. Karambit naturally defaults to that most powerful wrist position. This is one of the greatest strengths of it. It's a purpose-built weapon that understood the natural formation of the fist is not to be rigidly square. That hammer grip square fist really limits my mobility. With something like a gladius, it certainly serves its purpose, but these weapons were designed to fight in a phalanx with armored troops, all operating as one unit and heavily reliant on shield use. The moment we get into open space and we have variety, we see something like a cutlass or a saber naturally evolved the ricasso in all of these areas to have greater pointer flexion in the index finger. Kukris did the exact same thing, and karambits follow that same vein. That ring is not just there to give extra counter leverage against the fulcrum. It allows me to not deform my wrist, as so many people say, but to reform it the way it's intended to be, as if I'm holding a gun. And that gives me the straightest amount of power, and it gives me the greatest amount of play and flexibility. So that ring really is there to ensure flexion in the wrist. And when we grab the karambit, aside from making sure that our little fingers are tight around it and that the ring is there to assist, we also want to play with that flexion so that we know we can get absolute good piercing and penetration from both a squared and a deviated wrist.